What's up, party people? It's your host, Sunny Ray, for Building on Bitcoin. Today, I am joined by Dennis Porter. Dennis, how you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Sonny. Glad to be on here with you.
Yes, likewise. Dennis is the CEO of Satoshi Action Fund. They're originally a state-focused policy advocacy group, now focused more on the federal side of things. They've helped over 9 bills come into law. They've enabled more than 250,000 people to write in and get people really behind the Bitcoin cause and getting their governments behind it as well. So, Dennis, thank you for everything you do. I'm a big advocate and follower of yours on Twitter, and really excited about this call.
Thanks, Sonny. Yeah, I mean, it's great. All the work that we've done over the last 3 years has been something that we're really proud of at Satoshi Action, that we've been able to pull off these wins and really just add value to Bitcoin, right? At the end of the day, it's like, everyone wants to jump into this space when they hear about Bitcoin, I should say, when they fall in love with Bitcoin and they just want to do something in the Bitcoin space. So we're really proud that we've been able to get out there and do something. And we've passed those 9 bills into law. Those are the ones that are more so based on our model policy. Certainly, we've been involved in other pieces of legislation, but proud to say that those 9 bills came right off of the text that we wrote at Satoshi Action.
Amazing, amazing. So as I mentioned, I want to get into the weeds. I want to talk about, all the great work you guys are doing. But before we even get into your Bitcoin story, I love to capture a little bit about, kind of the man behind the mission and, what were you, who was Dennis Porter before you discovered Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Sonny, I'm just an average American, and certainly I've had some interesting things in my life that have helped me to better understand the value of Bitcoin. I would say most certainly the biggest thing that happened in my life was when I was 16. My family moved to Juarez, Mexico for 3 years. I lived in Juarez. I was able to see just the absolute demand for a different currency in that country. People were always wanting to get their hands on the dollar, and I couldn't quite understand it at the time, but after having moved away and looking back at where they are now, it's very clear and easy to see why so many people there would rather prefer the dollar over the peso. When I was there, it was a 10-to-1 exchange, which made things really easy. But now it's roughly a 20-to-1 exchange. And so the peso has lost nearly 50% of its value just since the time that it was about 5 years later, I believe, from when I left that occurred. So that really colored my understanding of why Bitcoin matters. And of course, always seeing people trying to get money across borders as well was another component of it. And, but after that, went on to try a million different things, I've done everything from sell knives to sell windows to work in the painting industry. So I've done a lot of different things, average jobs. And when I found Bitcoin in 2017, I was completely floored by its radical and revolutionary design. Someone, when I found it, told me, they said, this is perfectly anonymous internet money. And I was like, no way, that's not possible. So I actually went into Bitcoin with this desire to try to prove my friend wrong, that there's no way that anything on the internet could be anonymous. I went in and started to study the technical underpinnings of Bitcoin because that was the only way I could really understand if it was capable of being perfectly anonymous. And even though I'm not a technical person, I'm tech savvy, right? But I'm not a technical person. I'm not someone who can code. I'm not a developer. So I had to read the books that I was reading over and over and over again to finally understand it. I was reading Andreas Antonopoulos's Mastering Bitcoin, and it was just like, this is a foreign language to me. But eventually, I read it and started to watch as much as I could online, and finally came to the understanding that although Bitcoin is not perfectly anonymous internet money, and I was able to prove my friend wrong. Certainly, there are privacy enhancements of it, of course, but it's not perfectly anonymous internet money. But it is a very powerful tool for cross-border payments. It's a very powerful tool for savings. It's a very powerful tool for protecting the saver and protecting individuals from runaway monetary debasement, from inflation. That was how I foyed into this space. And right away, I started trying to figure out what I could do in the Bitcoin space. I wanted to see if I could make an app or do something. Uh, Quickly realized again that I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer. And then I moved on to Bitcoin mining. I started mining in my basement. I think I got up to like 16 machines or something along those lines, and built my own box for pointing it out my door. Because once you get past 3 machines in your house, the heat is a little too much. So I built my own, sort of. I don't know if people have heard of the black box from Upstream Data before. Maybe some would be familiar on this call. Mine was like a very, very, very crap version of the black box, and it had to be inside. It was not outdoor weatherproof. So got into it that way and just kept continuing to learn, and mostly in silence too. Like I didn't get online and start talking about Bitcoin on Twitter. I didn't start sharing my opinions about Bitcoin. I just continued to learn over the next 3, 4 years until around 2020 was when, I started to get really vocal about it. And, there's a lot more to go from there, but I'll leave it at there for now.
Yeah, so I'm excited to get in your Bitcoin story here. Well, what a fascinating beginning, by the way. Yeah, big fan of the upstream guys. They're also from Canada here. Hey, so were you always politically or economically curious?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's probably something to be, pointed to in my childhood and all growing up. My family was very politically oriented, always talking about politics. It was a kitchen table issue for us to all the time, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the political conversations, and me and my dad oftentimes going back and forth across from Juarez to El Paso when we were trying to go get food or trying to get supplies for some of the humanitarian work that we were doing there in Mexico. We would be listening to talk radio. We'd be listening to various pundits, and then me and my dad would of course would talk back and forth. So coming out of that, I actually thought for a while that I would be very politically engaged. I tried a few different things, made a couple different attempts. Like I got trained to be a campaign manager. I went through like an in person, like you got to fly there. They train you to do all sorts of political engagement, political activity. I wouldn't say it's like anything close to what you'd get if you were to go to a 4 year degree, but certainly it was really helpful in my ability to understand how to have an impact politically. And then that background of just constantly always talking about politics all the time. That was really probably what positioned me initially to understand that we needed to be politically active in the Bitcoin space. Because one of the things that we kept hearing was like, oh, we don't need to be engaged politically. Like Bitcoin is outside of politics and we can just stick our head down in the sand and wait for all this to go away. And I had a completely different perspective as someone who had, been a political junkie really my whole life. I saw that, one day we could wake up and we could be in the United States and we could have our right to self custody taken away from us. We could have our ability to be able to transact taken away from us. And we were actually headed down that path, which is why I was so concerned. And it's why even though I had started off in the Bitcoin space, a lot of people don't know this, but I was just a podcaster. I was like a media personality. And I started yelling at people like, we need to get politically active. And they were all like, oh, Dennis, you're crazy. And I started inviting politicians onto my show. I was one of the first to do that. I was one of the first to be on Twitter Spaces, like having these politicians like come into these spaces to talk about Bitcoin, because I understood that we need to educate these lawmakers and get them on board if we want to make sure our country is a leader on this technology. Because ultimately we have very limited options. Either we are going to head down a path of opposition to Bitcoin, neutrality to Bitcoin, or support of Bitcoin. And I wanted to make sure that our country was one of the best in the world for supporting this technology, which is ultimately what led to, me launching Satoshi Action Fund.
And that's so awesome. And was there a specific moment or conversation that made you stop and look deeper into Bitcoin?
It really actually was one of those times. I'm one of those few people where it was like my first experience with Bitcoin. I was all in. Like I was like, this is it. And I just fell down the rabbit hole immediately. Like I didn't hear about Bitcoin and then like wait a week or 2 weeks or a month or even or years to come back to it. I didn't start to study it and go, oh, this is a scam, and then come back to it later on. Like my friend told me, this is perfectly anonymous internet money, and so I started to study the hell out of Bitcoin to prove him wrong. And because I was so interested in proving my friend wrong, like I was just like, I'm gonna get this guy. Like I started to learn so much about it so rapidly that I never even took my foot off the gas. Like I have been since the moment I learned about Bitcoin in 2017, which that's the very first term I heard about it. Like I never heard about Bitcoin before 2017, which was sad because if I'd heard about it sooner, I'd probably be feeling a lot better right now about my Bitcoin. That's for sure. So I never took my foot off the gas. I've always just been all in on Bitcoin. I mean, you can ask any of my close family members. Like I've just been obsessed with Bitcoin since I've discovered it in 2017. And what are we like 8 years later? All in, running one of the most successful, Bitcoin political nonprofits in the world, and passed 9 bills into law. And we've had 250,000 letters sent to lawmakers, and we've done a dozen academic papers, 6 of which have been peer reviewed, which, a lot of folks don't really care about peer review, but politicians certainly do. So that's been really helpful for helping us get these bills across the line. We've got a great team. We've got an incredible policy director. We've got a great research lead, and our director of development, as well as the folks working on our comms and back end stuff behind the scenes, really enables me and our other team members to go out there and fight and really get these wins for Bitcoin. And we're really proud to say that we've protected the rights of Bitcoiners. 20 million actually, in fact, have their rights protected to be able to access Bitcoin, buy, sell, trade Bitcoin, to be able to self custody, to run a node, to be able to transact peer to peer. So those are really important to us, especially on the node side. It's something that I've actually gotten more vocal about recently. I think it's critical that we protect access to nodes, and not only from the political perspective, also like internal to Bitcoin, which is one of the main reasons why when I fell into the block size wars in 2017, which is what it was sort of at the tail end of it, but when I fell into that conversation and saw it all happening, it was really eye opening to me because I got to really look back and see the entire conversation instead of like, most people started it. I think it was 2016, maybe even 2015 when the dialogue started, and then it like came to a head in 2017 and kind of, you saw the actual split from Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin. But I was able to look at all that and go, well, to me, node access to nodes is like critically important to the future of Bitcoin and to the decentralization of Bitcoin. And the decentralization of Bitcoin is the only thing that ensures that it can continue to survive. Like it's the thing that protects all other parts of Bitcoin. Censorship resistance goes away if you don't have sufficient node decentralization. The ability for the hard supply cap even could go away if we don't have sufficient node decentralization. Like we have to be really careful about these things. So that's why we've protected it in law and in statute. But I also believe it's really important that we continue to fight to ensure that node decentralization continues to proliferate internal to Bitcoin as well, internal to the policies that are within Bitcoin itself.
Dude, your energy is electric. How I have a question for you. Did you have any doubts or misconceptions as you were falling down the rabbit hole, and like any major ones that stand out in your mind?
No,
None.
literally, like none. Like I was such a clean slate. Like I went in with no one was trying to pitch it to me too, to be clear. Like no, this guy was just trying to say I was like perfectly anonymous internet money, and I was trying to prove him wrong. And so it wasn't like, oh, this I kept hearing from it from all these people, and finally I went and took a look at it. I went in just with the mindset of like, I'm just going to prove this guy wrong and I'm going to walk away. And then while I was in there, I was so deeply like focused on the inner workings of Bitcoin that right away I just snapped for me. And I was just like, oh my God, this is going to completely change the world.
Yeah, that's a very unique story, and I've done like close to 200 of these podcasts, so that's good on you. So can you walk us through your personal Bitcoin awakening? Like what was it that clicked for you?
For me, it was really this idea of decentralization that enabled us to keep human beings from being able to manipulate the monetary supply. There's a really actually important reason for decentralization, and it's important to keep in mind that decentralization is also not something that we should just slap on everything. Like I think the space is starting to learn that. Like I always ask, I talk to a lot of lawmakers, I talk to a lot of staffers, and I try to explain to them like why decentralization matters for Bitcoin and why it's not necessarily critical to decentralize everything. Because at the end of the day, decentralization is very inefficient, extremely inefficient. But the reason that we utilize decentralization is to protect critical infrastructure, public infrastructure, or centers of power. And one really quick example of that is Washington, D.C. Like the reason why Washington, D.C. is so inefficient and slow and it's hard to get things done there is because the powers are so decentralized between the legislature, between the judiciary and the executive branch that it makes it very hard to get anything done. But the reason why we do that is because we want to make sure that we ultimately protect that power from being centralized. Because sure, could we get a benevolent dictator who comes in and does all these great things and our country goes the right direction for 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years? That's entirely possible. And we might go that direction rapidly. But we can also go the other direction very rapidly, and we can crumble and we can fall under the weight of an authoritarian who takes those reins of power and decides that, actually, I don't like what America has become. And I don't really want America to be prosperous. I just want it to be about me. I want it to be about what my ideas are. So that is why we have this extremely decentralized system. And we see this system replicated all over the world to keep the power from falling into the hands of one or a few people. And that is so we don't see the country go the wrong direction really rapidly. The same thing is true with Bitcoin. It's a very inefficient system to decentralize Bitcoin as radically as decentralized as it is. but it's necessary to protect the most important components of Bitcoin. So people will often say like, "Oh, I love Bitcoin because the 21 million hard supply cap, savings, cross-border payments, censorship resistance." They name all of these features. They talk about all these things that are important to them. But what they don't realize is that none of those are possible, or all of them can be eroded without radical decentralization of Bitcoin. And that's why during the block size wars, the people that were fighting for smaller blocks were so galvanized because they knew they needed to, at least in these early days, very stringently, and I believe we still need to very stringently protect the decentralization of Bitcoin. But do we need to apply that same level of decentralization to every other component of the crypto space? I mean, I'm no Bitcoin maxi. Like people call me Bitcoin maxi. I'm Bitcoin focused. Bitcoin is really the only thing I care about. Certainly, there are going to be other things that exist in the world outside of Bitcoin. I'm not to the point where I believe that it's going to be the only thing that'll ever happen in the crypto space. It's the only thing I own, if that's a clear enough message for people. But but my point is, there are going to be things that survive outside of Bitcoin. Could be gaming, could be smart contracts, could be stable coins, probably stable coins, definitely. There could be other things that come 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But do we need to radically decentralize gaming? Do we need to radically decentralize smart contracts? Maybe a little bit, but does it need to be so radically decentralized like literally those systems like don't work very well because they're so inefficient and we can't make the changes necessary to provide the proper products to the user base? Like at the end of the day, I view Bitcoin as like wholly separate, which I'm sure you do than the rest of the crypto space and probably a lot of your audience. But then you have all these crypto platforms out there that want to provide services to their clients. They want to provide smart contracts. They want to provide NFTs. They want to provide meme coins. They want to provide stable coins. They want to provide all of these things. But if they radically decentralize their systems to the same degree that Bitcoin is decentralized, it'll actually make it more difficult to provide those services, which in my opinion is actually also why you see a lot of the market share moving away from Ethereum and into these other protocols because they actually don't care about decentralization to the degree that the Ethereum community does. And so they're able to actually provide faster, more efficient services for things that people want and don't care that they're decentralized. And honestly, most people probably don't even care about decentralization in the first place. These are just very new and cool services that they can access. Particularly, I think stablecoins are like currently like the killer app of things that exist outside of Bitcoin. But to make sure that people actually can use stablecoins in an effective and efficient way, like you don't really want decentralization. And so to me, really, it was like knowing that this is a user-driven technology where there are extreme benefits to the user, and the users are extremely protected, and that is all protected through that decentralization, which hopefully will continue to stay in place. But there is just nothing else like that in the world, digitally at least, right? Like we can see the manifestation of that in things like Congress and Washington D.C. and other government agencies, or I would say other government structures. But we don't see that in the digital world. And in fact, I think it's even more extreme with Bitcoin than it is with those systems. Like, look how hard it is to make even a tiny, tiny little change to the block size in Bitcoin. Like, you can't make these big changes because people have ultimately come to the conclusion that, myself included, and many others, that we must radically protect this radical decentralization.
Beautiful. I love it. Hey, so you said, as soon as you discovered it, you started falling down the rabbit hole. You kind of haven't stopped since. But when was the point that you decided to dedicate your life to this industry? Was it shortly thereafter, or did it take a few months at least?
Um, I mean, there's phases of my Bitcoin career, certainly. There was the early rabbit hole where I went all in and just continued to study it every day, every night, taking in as much content as I could. Fortunately, in 2017, there was a little bit of content out there. I mean, I feel for guys like you back in the day or others, way back when. It's like I don't even know how you got to the point where you realized that you were all on board, which I think is actually part of the reason why a lot of the like some of the really OGs like lost a lot of their Bitcoin or spent it all because they just didn't even know what they had. And so I'm fortunate in some ways to have come about it in 2017 because there was that educational foundation for a tech savvy but non-technical person like myself to be able to wrap my brain around. But I would say about 3 years went by. I tried really hard. I was like, oh, I'm gonna do something, maybe build an app, something to make Bitcoin easier to use. That didn't work out for me. Tried to get mining. That didn't work out for me. Although I did do the mining, but I just didn't go large, didn't go big. And then a few years went by, and I saw Saylor started to talk about Bitcoin, and I, of course, understood the cycle theory, which is sort of being eroded as we speak, but it was definitely intact back then. And I was like, oh man, like Saylor's coming in, he's coming in a big way. We have cycle theory probably is going to play a role here again. Well, I got to do something like I just got to get into the space. Like I got to break in any way I know possible. And I decided, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to launch a podcast. I'm going to get into the space. I'm going to become a talker. Started off on Clubhouse and got a little bit more, sort of radicalized around Bitcoin. I'm probably less radicalized than I am during my Clubhouse era. The Clubhouse era was like just ultra maxis on Clubhouse, just talking about Bitcoin all day. So it was a very interesting time. But eventually, after I was on Clubhouse for a while, doing some content, putting panels together, I eventually moved to Twitter Spaces. My following exploded on Twitter and Twitter Spaces. I started to become very political and talk about the need to be political. And then I just realized, like, oh, like no one's actually going to go do this thing. Like you need to just go do it. And then people started telling me, like, man, maybe you should be the one to launch something. And I had a lot of ideas, but what eventually really galvanized people to realize that we need to become political, and even some of the most, I would say, less politically oriented people uh, came to this conclusion that we needed to become political around the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, when there was the broker amendment in there. They realized that, like, oh wow, your government can, like, legitimately could, like, backdoor ban self-custody and mining and all these parts of Bitcoin that are super important. And if you don't do something about it, like, you're going to wake up in 5, 10 years and your ability to directly engage with Bitcoin, not through some third party, but directly engage with Bitcoin, could have completely been eliminated. And your options are very limited at that point. You can either, you know, go to another country, which a lot of people were talking about. You can go to another country. You can sell all your Bitcoin or put it on some third party thing, right? Like you're not engaging directly. You comply, or you can go underground, which of course, a lot of people in the Bitcoin space were, oh, you don't need to worry about government because you can just go underground. Well, I'm not an underground kind of guy. Like, sorry, I'm not going to like live my life completely where I've become a public person and now I'm going to go underground. Like, that's not going to really work for me. And so I just woke up and I realized, like, if I want to avoid these circumstances, these bad circumstances, I'm going to have to get up and fight and become engaged and active. And that was the impetus for launching Satoshi Action Fund.
One of my one of my things is I've noticed that there's a lot of smart people, both in the world and the Bitcoin space. But what seems to be an even shorter supply than Bitcoin itself is courage. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I mean, you seem like a super courageous guy, but I'm sure there must have been times where you're taking on the United States government and trying to explain to them what this funny money called Bitcoin is. Like, how did you overcome some of those kind of internal dialogues that I'm sure you must have been having?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a concern. I would say maybe I slow walked myself into it a little bit. Certainly being a public person was a big shift. That was a big move, especially back in 2020, where there was still quite a lot of fears around identifying yourself as a Bitcoiner because you could be targeted for, whether it be from governments or whether it be through, like, wrench tax or whatever, right? Like people trying to steal your Bitcoin. And so that had already happened. So I'd already made that move. And then, I just started becoming very active about the need to become political and talking about it so much that it felt like, if I don't, it's like sort of like put your money where your mouth is, right? Like, at the end of the day, if you are out here talking about these things or anything, like if you're out there espousing the need for something, like you should be ready to jump into that space. And it felt like a very natural fit. And I've wanted to do something politically for, probably my whole life, really, ever since I was really young and could really understand the political space. Just something that we talked about so much in my family that it was kind of like revered a little bit, like in my family, almost like I would say somewhat like public service, but not quite to that extent. And I just realized that at the end of the day, had to, because if I didn't, then I'd either have to sell my Bitcoin or move to another country, and those just really weren't options that I was willing to take on. So I appreciate you saying that it takes courage. I think that it really just came down to the fact that I felt like I was the only option that I had left.
And Dennis, did your political or economic beliefs shift as a result of understanding Bitcoin, or was it more just like a magnification and amplification of what you already believed?
Um, I think certainly some things change because the more you understand Bitcoin, the more you understand the way the world works. So, as an example, when you're studying Bitcoin, you quickly learn about the impacts of the current monetary system that we live under and how it functions. And that learning about that and then learning about the fact that we have Bitcoin as a solution or as an alternative is something that changes the way that I view the political government space. I would also say that one thing sort of counterintuitively for most people in the Bitcoin space that I've come to appreciate is actually the importance of policy and the importance of long durable policies, or you could call them regulations. The reason why is because I actually have come to view Bitcoin as one of the most highly regulated monetary instruments on the planet, and that those regulations are actually tightly guarded and enforced. Don't look any further than the 21 million hard supply cap, the block size. Like these things are tightly controlled and regulated, extremely tightly controlled and regulated. And typically, especially as I grew up in a conservative family. I live in Portland, Oregon now, so I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily as conservative as I grew up, that's for sure. But I grew up in a very conservative family where, we're often taught like lack of regulation or like cutting regulation or removing regulations is a good thing almost always, like just by default. And so even as I started to change my political perception from like a right versus left, I kind of carried that with me all the time, even as I sort of migrated away from what I would say like traditional conservative views, where I still sort of was like always like yeah, let's get rid of these regulations, like they're not good, they're not important. And I would say my view on that has shifted to much more of um, a view that regulations are a tool and policy is a tool, and it can be good and it can be bad, and that you that's why it's so important that you get it right, and that you don't just say, oh well, we should just get rid of the regulations. Like, and that's kind of the view of the right. And of course, the left is, I would say, probably more to the other side where they're like, well, we just need more regulations, like just more and more and more all the time. And my viewpoint is just much more in the middle now. Like I'm much more of a person who views that you got to get the policies right and you got to make them durable, and you make them durable by getting broad consensus. So, like as an example, in the United States, when we pass a law, um, we go through this policy process where we try to figure out like how we're going to regulate. We're doing this right now with crypto, right? We're trying to figure out how we're going to regulate crypto. And I certainly think that we do need regulations. I think even Republicans and far right folks definitely agree with that as well, that we just need something. They want, some groups want a lot less regulation. They want a lot less control over these systems. And some groups, of course, want a lot more. And it's not really about like more or less. It's about just getting it right, like understanding how the technology works and deeply understanding how that not only the technology works, but also how we can use policy to improve or enhance the technology or to guide the technology the right direction. Because you can absolutely guide technology the wrong direction with policy, because you can create incentives with policy, just like you create incentives in Bitcoin through the different policies that are internal to Bitcoin. And I certainly have concerns with some of the regulations that they're discussing right now. I don't want to get too in the weeds about it. It's an ongoing conversation that we're having with a lot of offices in Washington, D.C. But there are incentives that are being created and look like they could inevitably be passed into law that I think Bitcoin will be fine, but I think that there's a lot of technologies and parts of the space that won't function properly or won't benefit well from the shift in this type of policy. And I also don't see it as like truly giving a boost to Bitcoin in any way, but it's neutral is fine with me when it comes to Bitcoin, right? Like just don't mess it up. Um, but just taking it back to the conversation around Bitcoin itself, like the same thing happens to Bitcoin all the time. Like we have these debates about policy changes to Bitcoin. We're having one right now around the op return debate, around expanding the op return so that you can fit more arbitrary data Of course, there's arguments on both sides. Of course, you've got the folks on the pro-op return side saying that they want to move it away from the UTXO, so there's no UTXO bloat. Then you have the folks on the other side who are saying that like this is just a slippery slope, right? And like just a continuation of allowing more bloat onto the blockchain, which ultimately is there's negative for decentralization and no decentralization. And this is just something that's taking place all the time. So I'd say that certainly Bitcoin has really, really made me understand the importance of policy regulations and getting them right, because it's not about more or less. It's about, is it going to enable the technology to flourish or be successful? It's really sort of like a yes or no question. Certainly you can be in the middle as well. But anyways, I'll stop there. I haven't talked about that before, so it was a little clunky trying to get that idea out there. But you asked me that question, and I'd never really thought about it before. But that's certainly an area where I feel that there is a big shift in my mentality around policy and government.
Fascinating. One more question. How did your social circle react when you went full time into Bitcoin advocacy mode?
I really didn't talk to very many people about Bitcoin in my own personal circles too much. Like I just wasn't like a big, I didn't push it too much with my own family and friends. Like I really just focused on my own work. So I would say that they just thought I was like, you know, just pursuing my passions, I guess. And like, certainly they thought it was a little bit far-fetched, but I think they'd all seen the growth in Bitcoin since 2017. So they were too worried about it, but definitely there was some concerns.
And then how did your public voice evolve, going from maybe more of an enthusiast to a full-blown policy advocate?
Uh, More rational. When you're a Bitcoin podcaster, an influencer, or whatever you want to call it, it's a media personality, you can just kind of say whatever you want and, you know, pump the Twitter engagement as much as you want. But as you fall into the political policy space and you become, a professional person or, a serious person, you have to be a little bit more cautious about how you engage on social media and how you speak as well. So there's a lot more reservation around, the words that come out of my mouth and the tweets that or what do we call them now? The zeets? Are we calling them the zeets? Exit? I don't know. We'll figure it out one day. The posts on social media in general, like, you just have to be more careful for sure.
Before we kind of shift gears into Satoshi Action Fund, I wanted to ask you one more question. So, what is your? I mean, I love how you don't consider yourself a Bitcoin maxi. You're open to the evolution of others. But what do you think separates a Bitcoiner from a crypto speculator?
That is hotly debated. I actually had I was participating in these debates a while ago, and I would have a hard time, really nailing it down, to be honest, anymore after going through those debates. Uh, it's almost like when you ask someone, like, what, for a religious person, you're like, how do you know if someone's really a Christian, right? It's kind of like, well, there's debates around that, right? Like huge debates around how you know whether someone is truly a Christian. Um, Same thing with Bitcoin. Like, how do you know if someone's a Bitcoiner? How do you know if they're a crypto person? I mean, certainly, I think that there are some components around Bitcoin. If you're going beyond just ownership, there's an understanding of Bitcoin that I think you get to where you realize that there's some pretty radical changes and improvements to society that it can make once you understand, I think, the full encompassing value of what it has to offer. I think that's kind of what separates people, because typically once they get to that point, they start to see the difference between the two. And maybe it is even just seeing the difference between the two, like knowing that there is a real difference is probably what makes someone more of a Bitcoin person versus like a crypto broadly person. I've met people that are invested or interested in crypto writ large that I would still classify as more so on the Bitcoiner side, because they just view those as like tech investments, which is probably the right way to view them. Certainly, I would definitely say it has to do with really truly just understanding what differentiates Bitcoin, but also why Bitcoin matters for the world today.
Cool, man. So let's shift gears into Satoshi Action Fund. So, in a sentence, how would you describe the mission?
Yeah, so Satoshi Action is a nonprofit that is dedicated to educating lawmakers and regulators on the benefits of Bitcoin and digital assets. We spend 100% of our time trying to ensure that not only lawmakers see the value of these technologies, but also are ready and willing to pass legislation into law to ensure that their state or their country can be a leader on the technology for generations to come.
And how did the organization come about? And like, what does it do, let's say, on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, day to day, I mean, it's a firestorm, right? It's like it can change all the time. It can be very consistent in some periods, but generally, um, well, I'll start with how it formed. So in 2022, I was on the hunt to do something, and I was able to fortunately run into like-minded folks very early on in that process, and ultimately launch Satoshi Action in June of 2022 with the express intent of really going to the states. And we certainly have moved beyond just the states and are working on the federal side now as well. But the states were really the only place that anything could truly happen because there was nothing happening in Washington D.C., nothing positive, anyways. So we went to the states. We started educating lawmakers and regulators on the benefits of Bitcoin, and then we immediately turned around and we craft model policies, which are basically simple versions of a bill with components in there that highlight how the state can integrate Bitcoin. So one example would be our what we call our Bitcoin rights bill, which protects the right to self custody, the right to run a node, the right to peer to peer transactions, and it's in very simple text. Like it's not like in legalese too much. And what you do is you just take that bill or that model bill to a lawmaker and you say, hey, like this is some ideas that we put down on paper. Would you be interested in running this type of language? And they say yes, and you take the model bill from you and they put it through the drafters who actually will like convert that model bill into the state's legislative code, and then the bill gets introduced. So that's like our bread and butter of what we do. We started off in 2023 as our first legislative cycle. So we were able to get 7 bills introduced based off of our model policy, and we passed 2 into law. The next year we did 14 bills and 2 passed into law. And then we're on our third year now. It's closing up pretty quickly here, 2025, because most legislatures are part-time. So they only meet for, 3, 4, 5 months, 6 months. So most states are done now. And we've been able to get 6 bills passed into law. So, or is it 5? Yeah, it's 5 bills passed into law right now. We've got 2 more bills that are still active that could potentially pass as well. And that's really sort of like the main focus of our work is just getting these bills across the finish line. Because at the end of the day, getting code into law, getting text into law is what we feel is a critical component of our work. Because if you go around and you sort of shout like, oh yeah, lawmakers are loving this stuff, and you get people to say good things about Bitcoin, and you get them to introduce cool Bitcoin bills, but if those bills never pass into law, like what have you really done other than just sort of like, you know, you've been able to like change the winds around Bitcoin like temporarily, because certainly the winds will change the other direction, and they do all the time. Like I think that's a big thing that people need to be aware of too in the space, like especially Bitcoiners. It's a really dangerous to like lull yourself into thinking like, oh, our government is always just going to be like pro Bitcoin now, and that's just not true. Like the way that the government views Bitcoin, or the people in I think the highest ranking positions of our government, is going to change all the time. And right now it feels like a high for a lot of people. And I think they're riding that high, but that high could crash very quickly if the wrong type of administration were to come into power. And so that's something that I think that Bitcoiners need to pay attention to. And it's also why during these times of, feeling like everything is going the right direction, that we need to get stuff passed into law. Because when the other administration comes, or when other administrations at the state level come, or when, there's maybe a big, if we see another SBF, FTX style collapse again, will lawmakers will still feel the same as they do today, or will they flip and will embolden and enable the people that have been anti-Bitcoin and anti-crypto to pass laws to oppose this technology? Well, the best thing that we can do to prevent things from going the wrong direction really rapidly is to pass bills into law. And so that's why we've done that. And it's important to note that also our work at the state level is done to I think build political support around ideas, because oftentimes people talk about like, why are you even doing this at the state level? Isn't only DC the thing that matters? Um, Absolutely not. That's definitely not true. It's something that we get a lot though. At the federal level and at the state level, there's important to note that anytime the federal government hasn't passed a bill or a law around a specific issue that the states, have authority over that area, And then also when state law conflicts with federal law, so in the case of like cannabis law, it's the onus is on the federal government to come enforce federal law. Whereas if you have an alignment with state and federal law and there are laws being broken, typically what happens is the federal government like works through local law enforcement to enforce those laws. So that's like, you know, what happens when you have a war on drugs. It's what happens when you have cannabis being illegal at the state and federal level is like you're getting like rounded up, you're getting, you know, arrested in your house for smoking cannabis. Whereas right now, generally it's like the foot is off the gas almost completely because so many states have passed cannabis legalization that it makes it very difficult for the feds to enforce it at all. So that's the same sort of thought process that we used around Bitcoin. It's like, well, worst case scenario, if things go bad, then we have all these states which essentially become like, you know, I hate to use the term, but sanctuary states for Bitcoin. And if you are a Bitcoiner, like you can go there and the federal government is going to have a very hard time enforcing anti-Bitcoin laws that it has at the federal level. So the states act as a way to drive political support for ideas that could inevitably take place in Washington, D.C. or manifest in Washington, D.C. But again, are also a backstop against federal overreach as well, or laws that try to ban Bitcoin or the usage of Bitcoin.
Are you at all involved with the strategic Bitcoin reserve, or have you played a part in that? Yeah, I'm just curious, and yeah, if so, like what might that have been, and what are your thoughts on it?
So at the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve policy, I mean, we were the first organization in history to pass Strategic Bitcoin Reserve legislation into law in New Hampshire. And we also helped to usher the second Strategic Bitcoin Reserve legislation across the finish line in Arizona. And then just recently in Texas, you know, part of our model language was used in the bill there, and we were very focused on that. In fact, we did spaces with the original bill sponsor to announce the launch of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve effort in Texas. We've also been in close comms with the folks there. I think I was even the first person to announce that the bill passed into law. So certainly we have been very involved with that conversation. Also on the federal side, you know, I was the first person to announce that Trump was going to launch a strategic Bitcoin reserve if he was to win office during the 2024 Nashville conference. So I was able to put that out there. And of course, you know, people were like, how do you even know this? And he came onto the stage and announced it. So certainly we've been involved and, you know, we're a part of the conversations across the space. And we've been intimately familiar with how to pass this stuff into law in 3 states now.
In my view, this is probably the most like monumental thing that I've ever like heard about, come across, and I still pinch myself almost every day, wondering if this is even real or not. But can you like for those maybe hearing this about this for the first time or who haven't quite wrapped their head around the implications of this, what this might mean, definitely in the United States, but globally, can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you know, people are probably, it depends on where they are. If they're a Bitcoiner, they probably don't need too much of an explaining. But like, I guess for just broadly people across the world, like the reason why a strategic Bitcoin reserve is so important, I think, especially at the state level, is because these states, they don't have their own money printer. They don't have their own ability to just raise their debt ceilings to whatever they want. And so when tough times come, when monetary debasement takes place, which is typically coincides with tough times, you see the purchasing power of the dollar drop significantly. So since 2018 alone, the dollar has lost 25% of its purchasing power, which is really tough for states who are on, you know, limited budgets and who don't have a money printer. Because if they lose purchasing power, I mean, 25% is a lot, then they don't have the ability to pay for the programs or the roads or the schools that they would have with the purchasing power that they had only just back in 2018. Uh, Similarly, if they can't pay for those roads and programs, they're going to do, you know, one of two things. They're going to cut those programs or they're going to raise taxes. Both of those things are bad for, I think, residents of those states. So what a Bitcoin strategic Bitcoin reserve does is it helps protect against that type of loss of purchasing power. Since 2018, as I mentioned, we've seen a 25% loss of purchasing power from the dollar. So if you had $1, it's now worth 75 cents in purchasing power. If the state had made only a 3% allocation to Bitcoin in 2018, they would have combated 100% of that loss of purchasing power. So it's a very powerful technology for protecting taxpayer funds. And this is something that we've outlined in empirical data. We did a whole paper on this with our research lead, Dr. Murray Rudd. He's, you know, PhD, former endowed chair, former UN former Canadian government. Like he's been all over the place. And he did this paper for us with us at Satoshi Action. And it showed that what we were saying that, we were saying, we're telling lawmakers, oh, this is great for protecting taxpayer funds, but we like really showed it in empirical data. And we even used their state's own data because this is all public information. And we take their data and we plug in what happened with Bitcoin and we say, like, look, all you needed was 3%. Like you didn't need to be like YOLO'd into Bitcoin to protect taxpayer funds. You just needed a very small sliver. Certainly, if you buy a little more, you can, outperform. But that's not what we're pitching to these lawmakers because most lawmakers are not geared toward like, oh, how do I make sure that my state like is like speculating on things properly so that we can make more money? Now, some states do. Alaska, they have the permanent fund there. They have one in New Mexico. I believe they have one in Arizona. Actually, the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve in Texas is somewhat of a fund that's separate. So that's a really interesting difference for how they're running things there. It's very much like what they do in Alaska, but just for Bitcoin. But we're not pitching that to these state lawmakers. So, but that's a different pitch from like, let's say like at the federal level, where at the federal level, like the idea around a strategic Bitcoin reserve is much more of a geopolitical concern. You have a rapidly changing world. I mean, we just bombed Iran. Iran just bombed our bases in, I think it was Kuwait. I don't know. I didn't see, I just saw the news clip like right before I come on here. And so they bombed our military bases. So like you've got BRICS going wild, like building up their support. You've got a lot of people who are seeing US as an aggressor, wanting to get away from those systems. When the Ukraine went to war with Russia, we kicked them out of the financial system. We kicked Russia out of the financial system that we own and create and control. So like people are starting to be like, oh my God, like maybe we need to have another solution. And that's why BRICS, I think, is becoming popular. And there are other solutions that I think people are trying to develop. So in a world where the United States could lose its hegemony or where it could lose at least a portion of its control, I think it's really important to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which is, I view it as like the world's like, neutral money, neutral payment system, much like Switzerland. And to prepare for that environment where, we could lose that status, a world which would become much more bipolar, I think is a world where Bitcoin becomes much, much more valuable. And we should be preparing for it because that's just what we do as a country. That's what countries do. They prepare for extreme externalities. I mean, take, for example, all the different reserves that we currently have. I mean, we have animal reserves, we have agricultural reserves, we have a cheese reserve, we have medical supply reserves. In fact, the medical supply reserve one is the one that's like the greatest example of what happens when you don't adequately prepare for extreme externalities as a country to protect your people. During COVID, we saw, and I don't know your political opinions about COVID, but let's just either way, when it happened, when we started to shut everything down and there were so many people going into hospitals, we didn't have the medical supplies to keep up with that situation. And so we started to see doctors and nurses wearing like garbage bags for medical gowns because we didn't have the proper supplies. We were running out of beds. We were running out of things left and right. And because of that, we probably saw more people die. Probably more people got sick. And we could have prevented that if we had adequate medical supplies in reserve. And so my reasoning for more of like a strategic Bitcoin reserve at the national level is less so to be like, pay off the debt, which I think is like great, or like to invest money so we have more money. It's more to like protect against these extreme black swan events that we don't really know when or where or how big they are going to be. And it's clear that Bitcoin can provide a value there. And so for the United States government right now, the ability to buy insurance, which is what Bitcoin is, against the loss of hegemony status or an increasingly bipolar world, that insurance is very cheap right now. Like Bitcoin is very, very, very low priced for what it will be valued at if we do enter that type of a black swan event where all of a sudden it becomes radically important to have a little bit of Bitcoin. So that's kind of the reasonings. They're very different. You have the federal level one and you have more of like the state focused one because the states aren't really, the states leave international politics and geopolitics up to the federal government, but they still need to protect themselves when the federal government decides to print too much money or spend too much money, which results in the loss of purchasing power of the dollar.
Wow. How can everyday Bitcoiners support your work and help move the needle politically?
Well, they can, I think the best thing that you can do right away is sign up for our newsletter, satoshiaction.io. make sure you're staying up to date with what we're doing. We do have a happy hour coming up in Washington, D.C. on the 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. People can, uh, go look that up on my social media. I've posted about it. I'll post about it again today. It's going to be maxed out. It's going to be a great group of folks there. So come join us for that as we talk about what's next for Satoshi Action. And then also, if people really are, really believe, they're listening to me and they're like, yeah, all these things need to happen, or these things are true, or we need to make sure we continue to lead. We need to make sure that our government understands the value of Bitcoin and that we pass very pro Bitcoin legislation into law. We need people to financially support us because we're just a nonprofit. Like we don't mine Bitcoin. We don't have a wallet. We don't have a service that we provide. The only way that we are able to go out and do what we do is because donors like the ones that we have decided to support us. But we are a very small nonprofit. I mean, there are most nonprofits that do what we do are 10 times older and 10 times larger than we are. And you can ask this about anybody that you want in the nonprofit space. Every single time I meet people in the nonprofit space that are adjacent, that are not in Bitcoin, and they say, "Oh, how long have you been around?" I'm like, "Oh, since June of 2023, like we're literally 3 years old." And they're like, "Are you serious? Like I thought you would have been at least like 10 years old by now. Like there's no way that you guys are getting all this done." So I think people should appreciate the moment that we have at Satoshi Action, where we have just this incredible team and we can really get so much done for Bitcoin in such a short period of time. And that if people want to continue to see us do that and do it in a bigger way, then we need those folks to, go to our website and donate, or, give me a ring, and I'm happy to share more. If you're considering, giving a larger amount, I'm happy to, fly on a plane to you if I have to. Like, I mean, I pretty much live on planes. So, that's an offer that I'm willing to always make.
Dennis, what's your vision of success 5 to 10 years from now for the US and Bitcoin?
Well, we need to do a few things. One is we need to get the market structure legislation and stablecoin legislation right. And that's going to happen here shortly. And then, potentially we have the opportunity for some type of strategic Bitcoin reserve to be codified into law. I think that's important. But also, one thing that we haven't really, I think, leaned into enough that we need to is the ability to use Bitcoin mining as a powerful energy tool. Really, it's been sort of left on the sidelines to, um, you know, let people just sort of go after in their own kind of way instead of finding ways, instead of finding methods or policies to enhance the usage of Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining is one of the most powerful tools in the world for balancing the grid. It is incredibly powerful for energy development, particularly powerful for wind and solar development. And we're not really doing anything to encourage that behavior. We're just like keeping our hands off. But you don't see that in the rest of the energy space. Like look at renewables, look at, even oil and gas, look at batteries. Like all of these technologies have massive government incentives and programs around them, lending programs, borrowing programs, tax write-offs, like you name it. Like the energy space is littered with different types of programs to help encourage the growth of different types of approaches to energy. And I think that we should be doing that same thing in the right way with Bitcoin mining, because I think this is the pushback that I get. People are like, "Well, we don't want to just throw money at Bitcoin mining." No, I don't want to throw money at Bitcoin mining just for the sake of it. I think there are smart policies that we can come to consensus on that will ensure that we are able to benefit in a better way from the technology. I mean, Bitcoin mining has literally already saved lives in this country, and we didn't even do anything to encourage that behavior. If you look at what happened in the state of Texas, there were two big winter storms. One was Winter Storm Uri, one was Winter Storm Elliott. Winter Storm Uri came through, billions of dollars in damages, completely demolished the Texas grid. 700 plus people died, maybe even more than that, because they were not able to keep the power on. Well, if you fast forward to the next year when Winter Storm Elliott came, it was the same type of storm, almost identical, but they had a lot more tools in their tool basket, including Bitcoin mining, which had just recently left China and came to Texas, plugged into their grid, plugged into pre-existing grid balancing programs. And when that emergency happened, the miners were ready and willing to wind down and deliver that power back to the grid, ultimately reducing the damages that were done to the grid and likely saving lives because not a single person died from power outages that year. So, and if people think I'm being hyperbolic, just keep in mind that the amount of energy that was delivered back to the grid during that storm was roughly 1,400 megawatts of power. Actually, no, it was marked up to 1,700 megawatts of power. 1,700 megawatts of power is enough power to heat 1.7 million small homes. It's enough power to energize over 300 large hospitals. So it's a huge amount of power. It's not like we're just like, oh, well, we're saving lives by switching off our lights at our home. No, no, no. This is multiple power plants of power, maybe four or five, depending on the size, right? I mean, these things can range dramatically in size, anywhere from 100 megawatts to a gigawatt sometimes. So you're talking about an entire nuclear plant plus that is given back to the grid during the middle of an emergency when everybody else is trying to stay warm, everybody else is trying to stay alive. The Bitcoin miners are like, yep, we're ready, we're willing to do this, partly because the cost of energy is going up, and that is part of you know the system with Bitcoin mining. If the cost of energy goes up too high, they want to shut off so they don't have to lose money. The other really big one though is that they participated in smart grid balancing policies like demand response, which encourage them to shut down during these types of events. And so the grid was able to rely on the Bitcoin miners. And in fact, they knew that there was 1.7 mega, 1.1700 megawatts, 1.7 gigawatts of power that was being used by the Bitcoin miners because they just did a winter resource report months before that storm even happened. So they knew these miners were there, ready and willing to help, and they did. And that's why I say I think and I believe that they ultimately saved some lives.
Amazing, Dennis. Wow, what an hour together. Leave us with your Twitter handle just so that people can follow you and yeah, follow more closely with what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, Sunny. I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. If folks want to follow me or Satoshi Action, they can follow me by going to Dennis underscore Porter underscore, or they can go to Satoshi Act Fund on Twitter. Also sign up for the newsletter at satoshiaction.io.
Amazing. Thank you all for tuning in, and this is Dennis Porter.